So here we have Nvidia's 4080 and AMD's 7900 XTX, and for the most part, the performance of these two GPUs is about the same. Like if you're benchmarking 4K ultra settings across 12 or so games, you average it out and the numbers are basically as close as you'll ever get. But there is actually a huge difference between these two GPUs which you probably didn't know about. Now, for this generation of GPUs, power consumption does seem to be a bit better on the Nvidia side of things. Like generally speaking, if we crank both GPUs to the max with ray tracing and ultra settings, yeah, there is a bit of a gap worth considering here in favor of the 4080. If we take a look at total system power draw from the wall, it's almost a 100 watt difference, which is pretty massive. The real big difference though is actually in games which aren't as demanding. So 1440p resolution, a few games here that are easier to run at lighter graphic settings, you begin to see something that's really interesting. Whereas the 4080 begins to pull less power the easier the game is to run, the 7900 XTX on the other hand is basically just pinned at the same level. It's only in Apex Legends, where there's actually a 300 FPS frame cap, that the 7900 XTX has a chance to catch its breath. But in F122, Rainbow Six, I mean, these are pretty popular games that aren't super graphically intensive to run. The difference there is over 130 watts. Then in Overwatch 2, absolutely huge difference there of over 200 watts. As far as AMD is concerned, apparently this game is just as demanding to run as Doom running Ultra Nightmare ray tracing. I mean, the power levels are identical. And then we have CSGO, even more lightweight to run, but the differences here are just insane. Like the system with the 4080 is pulling less than 100 watts in total. AMD on the other hand is just far out of reach. So let's take a closer look at what's happening here. For this, we'll need something that's more accurate than just measuring the total system power from the wall, and so here I've hooked up the PCAT from Nvidia. PCAT stands for Power Capture Analysis Tool, and it does exactly that. It plugs directly between the power cables on the GPU, measures the power going through it, and it also measures the power being drawn at the PCIe slot. This way, we can isolate our power testing just for the GPU, and not also have the CPU, the liquid cooler, and the RAM also being thrown into the mix. So CSGO then, running 1440p, low settings in a 10-minute bot deathmatch, and both the RTX 4080 and 7900 XTX push out fairly similar numbers in terms of average FPS. But taking a closer look at the amount of power that each GPU is pulling, I mean, it's a pretty monster difference. On average, a gap of almost 150 watts. So roughly the same frame rate at a dramatically lower power draw. That makes the 4080 over 3 times more power efficient when looking at performance per watt in this particular scenario. Also looking at GPU usage here, the 4080 was at 32%, while the 7900 XTX was almost double at 67%. At the very least, I guess it gives us a closer look at why this might be happening. But where it gets really interesting is when we take a look at just like what effect this insane difference in power consumption has on the end user. The 4080, pulling just 65 watts here, ran CSGO completely passively. Like the fans just didn't start spinning at all, and after our 10-minute run, it was still under 50 degrees C. I mean, at first I thought I had VSync on or a frame cap by mistake or something like that, but no, these were identical settings to the AMD card, which on the other hand spun the fans up immediately, pulled 150 watts more, and was at 60 C by the end of it, and that was with a bigger cooler as well. And there's another pretty massive difference, which I honestly didn't even think about until I saw it firsthand or heard it firsthand with these two cards running on the test bench, and that is coil whine. Let's just say the high frame rates and the high power draw, it's not a good match. Overwatch 2 is another interesting example. Personally, this is what I'm playing mostly these days, and again, roughly even performance here between the 4080 and the 7900 XTX. Like, you could be playing on either card here and have a virtually identical experience. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference aside from your PC noise levels, temperatures, and your power bill at the end of the month. Here I saw a monster 165 watt difference between the two, which is just ridiculous for two GPUs that are meant to be comparable. I mean, 165 watts, that's like the entire power consumption of a 4060 Ti. I also thought it was interesting that the AMD card even pulls more just sitting in the menu. Like the 7900 XTX just in the game menu is roughly the same as what the 4080 is pulling while actually playing. Now I think we all agree that aside from this pretty massive difference, AMD have actually done a pretty good job of catching up to Nvidia this generation. Like we've seen leaps and bounds on their software side of things. Their AI upscaling is pretty good now. Their ray tracing, it's not quite there yet, but is also, definitely usable. And I've also taken a look at their AV1 encoding. I mean, there is basically no difference there to speak of. Let's also not forget that the performance per dollar is definitely better on the AMD side of things. Like the 7900 XTX you can find for $300 cheaper than a 4080, and $300, that is a massive difference when comparing equally performing GPUs in terms of frame rate. Like $300, that's enough to cover your CPU, like a 5800X3D, for example. But this difference, this just gigantic difference in power efficiency when running esports titles and just generally lighter to run games, it is just too big to ignore. And what is absolutely crazy to me is that if you ask any PC hardware enjoyer which pulls more, an AMD GPU or an Nvidia GPU, they will hands down say an Nvidia GPU. And look, they were definitely the front runners in the kind of 300 watt plus GPU territory and making that kind of the standard. And we've all seen the headlines of the melting power connectors. But I've got to say, looking at things as they are now, the difference couldn't be more opposite. So yeah, this just mostly affects the current generation of things as well. I did also test out the 3090 versus the 6950 XT, and those two GPUs seem a lot more closely matched in terms of power draw in these specific scenarios. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Hopefully AMD can sort this out. If not with a software update, then at least with the next generation. But yeah, let me know what you think. I'll see you all on the next one.